Okay, so let's imagine for a second, like, what if our kids were actually pumped about chores, right?
Hmm.
And homework wasn't a constant struggle. And instead of being this thing that like tears families apart, technology actually brought us closer.
Yeah, wouldn't that be amazing? It's definitely something a lot of parents long for.
Totally. And you know what? It might be more doable than we think.
Really?
That's actually what we are going to be diving into today with these excerpts you sent over from Raising Mentally Strong Kids.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, have you heard of this one?
I have, yeah. It's by, let's see, Daniel Amen. He's a psychiatrist, and Charles Fay, who's a child development expert.
Right, and it really caught my eye because it's all about, how to raise kids who are resilient and responsible and successful.
For sure. And what I find really fascinating about their approach, they call it practical neuropsychology, is how it combines neuroscience with down-to-earth parenting advice.
So it's not just about like discipline or, getting kids to behave a certain way.
Exactly. It's about understanding how their brains actually develop and then using that to guide your parenting.
So it's like building that inner strength from like the ground up.
Exactly, yeah. Amen and Fay argue that a healthy brain is really the foundation for, well, everything else. Things like emotional well-being, resilience, even academic success.
It all starts there.
Exactly. And they even talk about these neurotoxins that can actually harm a child's brain health. Some of them might surprise you.
Okay, now you have to spill the tea. What kind of everyday things are we talking about here?
Well, let's talk about sugar, for example. I mean, we all know it's not the best for our bodies, right?
Right.
But this book really digs into how too much sugar can really mess with a child's ability to focus. Remember those homework meltdowns we were talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Sugar could be playing a much bigger role than you realize.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I know after I have a sugary drink, even I can barely focus.
Right. And think about sleep, too. You know how cranky and irritable a sleep-deprived teenager can be?
Oh, tell me about it.
Imagine that, but magnified, because their brains are still developing and they're even more susceptible to those negative effects of not getting enough sleep.
Wow.
We're talking mood swings, trouble concentrating, even problems with learning and memory.
Okay, so starting to rethink those late night study sessions now. So we've got cutting back on sugar, prioritizing sleep. But what about making this fun for kids? I mean, I'm not about to sit my 5-year-old down for a lecture on neurotransmitters,
Absolutely not. The book actually talks about this really cool concept called the Chloe game, named after Dr. Amen's daughter.
Okay.
It's a fun and age-appropriate way to teach kids about making those healthy choices for their brains.
Okay, I'm listening. How does it work?
It's all about asking these really simple questions. So for your 5-year-old, you might say, we're having broccoli with dinner tonight. Is broccoli good for our brains or bad for our brains?
And I'll be like, good for my brain.
Exactly. And you can adjust the questions as they get older, making it relevant to their lives. Imagine asking your teenager, hey, staying up all night playing video games, good for the brain or bad for the brain?
Okay, now that would definitely spark some interesting dinner table conversations. But it's not all about the physical stuff, right?
So,
This book really seems to frame mental strength more holistically. What else comes into play?
you're absolutely right. And while, that healthy brain is the foundation, Amen and Fay have identified 4 interconnected areas that really contribute to this idea of mental strength.
Okay,
And those are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual.
I see.
And they illustrate this really well with a story about a mom, Susan.
Okay.
Susan's juggling work, 4 kids, a million responsibilities. She's exhausted, feeling constantly overwhelmed, like she's failing all the time.
Oh, I think every parent can relate to that feeling at some point.
Right. And the book really dives into how imbalances in those 4 areas, the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual, were really showing up in her life.
Okay. So biologically, she wasn't getting enough sleep. Her diet, well, let's just say it wasn't very brain boosting.
So that sugar overload, it's not just for kids.
Exactly. And psychologically, she was carrying a ton of guilt and stress, always putting everyone else's needs before her own. Socially, she'd kind of isolated herself, feeling like she didn't have anyone to talk to.
Right.
And spiritually, she really lost sight of her own passions and any sense of purpose.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But it highlights something so important, right? Mental strength isn't just about our kids. We, as parents, we need to prioritize our own well-being too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like they say on the airplanes, put your own oxygen mask on first.
Exactly. So how do we actually put all of this into practice? Well, the book digs into different parenting styles, and it really advocates for what they call this consultative style.
Okay.
And it's all about finding that sweet spot between like being too permissive on one hand and like being super strict on the other.
So no helicopter parenting, but we're also not barking orders like a drill sergeant. Exactly. And they have these hilarious anecdotes to illustrate it, like there's this one about a dad who was constantly rescuing his teenage daughter from like every little mishap. Right, like forgotten homework, misplaced permission slips, you name it. He'd drop everything to like bring it to her.
Oh, I mean, I totally get it. Like, you want to protect your kids.
Right.
But you can also see how that would totally backfire.
Exactly. And he thought he was helping, but in reality, he was preventing her from learning that responsibility, like building those essential problem-solving skills.
It's so true. Okay, so what does this consultative style actually look like in action? What's the secret sauce?
It's about striking that balance.
Yeah.
You know, like setting those clear boundaries, so that's like the structure part.
Right.
But also showing empathy and understanding, which is the love part.
Okay.
And they really emphasize the importance of having those clear family rules.
Yeah.
Like actually writing them down together as a family.
So not just like the implied rules, like don't set the house on fire, but we need to get specific.
Exactly, yeah. So think, tell the truth. No arguing with parents, contribute to the family.
Right.
Just like simple, clear expectations that everyone's on the same page about.
Right, because kids are, they're master rule benders. They'll find a way.
Oh, they will.
So how do they recommend, how do we handle those inevitable moments when, the rules are broken? Because it's going to happen.
It is. And they introduced this really interesting technique called the energy drain technique.
Okay.
Which really focuses on setting those limits while staying calm. Because, when we get all emotionally charged up, it just makes everything worse.
Well, 100%. My fuse is definitely shorter when I'm tired or stressed, which, let's be honest, as parents is a lot of the time. So how does this energy drain help with that? Like, paint me a picture. My kid is glued to their video game. They're ignoring dinner, homework, everything. What do I do?
Right. So in that moment, instead of yelling, which is usually my go-to,
right,
or like getting into this power struggle, you calmly state that expectation, like dinner's ready, please come to the table now.
Okay.
And then you disengage.
Disengage? What does that look like? Do I just walk away?
Essentially, yes. You're no longer feeding into that argument, right? So you might say something like, I love you too much to argue about this, or even just, I've said what I need to say. But the key here is staying calm, being consistent.
So we're not giving in, but we're also not engaging in this, battle of wills.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. But what about those bigger challenges though that feel like they go beyond just setting a limit, the kid who's constantly underachieving or seems totally glued to their devices, or maybe they're dealing with something as serious as bullying. I mean, the book addresses this kind of stuff, right?
It does. And it offers some really insightful perspectives on navigating those challenges in a way that actually turns them into opportunities for growth.
Okay, I like that.
So let's take that underachieving child, for example. A lot of times we just jump to those conclusions, right? Like, oh, they're lazy.
Yeah.
They just don't care.
Yeah.
But this book really encourages us to dig a little deeper.
To look beyond just those surface level assumptions.
Exactly.
What are some other possibilities there?
Well, there could be, an undiagnosed learning difference. There could be some underlying emotional issues that they're dealing with. Or sometimes they just haven't found something that they're passionate about yet. And it's really our job as parents to help them kind of uncover those root causes.
Yeah, because it's so easy to just say, oh, just try harder.
Right.
But instead, we need to be having those open and honest conversations and really listening to what they're struggling with.
Exactly, yeah. And the book talks about, working collaboratively with your child to find those solutions.
Okay.
So it might be, creating a study schedule together. Maybe it's setting some realistic goals or finding ways to make learning more engaging and relevant to what they're into.
It's about empowering them to take ownership over their education, not just forcing them to do it.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk tech addiction. This is huge these days, and it feels like a constant battle in so many households. How does the book suggest we handle this one?
Yeah, they acknowledge it's a huge challenge, and their approach really centers on this idea of setting those healthy boundaries.
Okay.
And we're talking about things like establishing those screen-free zones in the house, having like those designated times for the technology use, and being really clear about what's acceptable online behavior.
So it sounds like it's more than just like practical tips, right? Do they
Right.
talk about like the why behind those limits? Because, I mean, let's be real. If I just go to my teenager and I'm like, put your phone down, they're going to be like, why?
Exactly, and that's what I appreciate about the book. It does a really good job of explaining how excessive screen time can actually impact their developing brains.
Okay.
They talk about how it can make it harder to focus, to regulate emotions, and even, to form healthy relationships.
Okay.
So you're giving them the why behind the boundary, which I think is so key, especially as they get older, those teenagers.
Right, because if we can explain like how it's impacting their well-being, they're more likely to actually listen and cooperate.
Exactly. And of course, we have to model those healthy habits ourselves.
Oh, that's a good point.
We can't expect them to put their devices down if we're constantly on our phones, right?
That's a good reality check for sure. Okay, let's move on to another tough one, bullying. What's their take on how to empower kids to handle these situations?
So instead of just saying, like, ignore it or,
Uh-huh.
fight back, which we know can often escalate the situation,
Right.
the book really emphasizes teaching kids those assertive communication and conflict resolution skills.
Okay.
It's about giving them the tools to navigate these situations
Yeah.
safely and effectively.
So it's teaching them to like set boundaries with other people, stand up for themselves, but also know when to like seek help from an adult if they need it.
Exactly, yes. And teaching them, like, what bullying is, right? Understanding those power dynamics that are at play,
Right.
and then how to respond in a way that prioritizes their own safety and their well-being.
Yeah, because it's not always easy to know, especially in the moment, what to do. So it's great that they actually give those tools.
Right.
And it seems like a common thread throughout this whole book is like giving kids those skills, that understanding so they can navigate challenges,
Yes.
It's not about just trying to like shield them from every challenge. It's about equipping them to handle it.
Exactly. And that's particularly important, when we're dealing with these more complex family dynamics, things like divorce, blended families, things like that.
Yeah, let's talk about that because that can bring a lot of unique challenges for, everyone involved, both the kids and the parents. So what kind of guidance does the book offer in those situations?
Well, they really emphasize the importance of maintaining consistency, even amidst all of the changes that are happening.
Okay.
So things like keeping those clear rules and boundaries, making sure there's open communication happening both between the parents and with the kids, and really creating that stable and loving environment, which we know is so important for kids, especially during those times of transition.
Right. And it sounds like such a delicate dance to manage, especially when emotions are running high, for everyone. So what are some practical things that they recommend?
Well, they recommend creating that shared parenting plan
Okay.
that both parents can actually agree on, and then setting those clear expectations for behavior at each home.
Right.
And even, finding ways to celebrate those special occasions together,
Yeah.
as a family, even if it looks different from that traditional model.
Right. Because there is no one size fits all.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the neuroscience of brain health to practical parenting strategies. But I'm curious, does the book address those later years, when we're dealing with adult children who maybe they're struggling to launch into independence? Is there anything in there about that?
There is. And they pose a really important question, which is, do those love and logic principles still apply when our kids are grown up?
Right, because the stakes feel so much higher.
They do.
When we're dealing with adult children who are, still living at home, or maybe they're making choices that we don't necessarily agree with. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, and you know what? The book's answer is a resounding yes.
Okay.
Those same core principles, that empathy, those clear boundaries and letting go of control, they become even more crucial in this phase of parenting.
Okay. Can you give me an example? What would that look like in a real life situation?
Sure. So let's say you have an adult child who's, still living at home, and maybe they're not contributing financially or helping around the house.
Right. A common scenario.
Right. Instead of, nagging them or constantly rescuing them, the book suggests having that calm, respectful conversation about your expectations.
Okay.
So you might say something like, we love having you here, but in order for this to work for everyone, We need you to contribute to the household.
Right, because they're adults now. We can't just be treating them like, when they were teenagers.
Exactly, exactly. And the book actually gives some really great examples of those healthy boundaries you can set. Like, maybe establishing a curfew, having really clear expectations for things like rent or chores, and even, setting that reasonable time frame for them to work towards independence if they are living at home.
Yeah.
It's about providing that support, but also encouraging that self-sufficiency.
Finding that balance, which, let's be real, parenting is all about finding that balance. So we've covered so much today. From the actual science behind how our kids' brains develop to these practical, tactical things we can do in our everyday lives as parents. If you had to pick, what are a few key takeaways, things that are really going to resonate with our listener? What would you say?
Oh, that's a great question. And there's so much valuable information packed in this book. I really love that 130 Things You Can Do chapter.
Yeah.
Especially for people like our listeners,
Yeah.
right, who want that actionable advice.
Yes. They want those, what can I do today kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. So if I had to narrow down, I'd say first and foremost, praise effort over intelligence.
Yes.
As we touched on earlier, it's really about focusing on, your child's hard work,
Yeah.
their perseverance, their resilience, rather than just praising them for being smart.
Right.
And this helps cultivate that growth mindset,
Yeah.
which is so essential for them to overcome those challenges
Yeah.
and really reach their full potential.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of oh, you're so smart, but it's really about you worked really hard on that. I'm so proud of you for sticking with it,
Exactly. And, along those lines, I think modeling the behavior that we want to see in our kids is huge.
Oh, that's huge.
We can't expect them to be respectful or prioritize healthy habits or manage their screen time if we're not doing those things ourselves.
So true.
Kids are little sponges. They pick up on everything.
Yes.
And a lot of times they're learning more from what we do than what we say.
Right. It's that whole do as I say, not as I do thing.
Exactly. And we all know that doesn't work.
Not at all. So what else stood out to you?
Well, the book emphasizes the importance of family meals.
Okay.
And I know that might sound, kind of simple and maybe even cliche, but I think in our busy, chaotic world today,
Yes.
it's so easy for that to fall by the wayside, right?
Oh.
And they highlight how crucial those regular moments of connection really are. Putting those devices away, engaging in those meaningful conversations,
Right.
and just strengthening those family bonds, because ultimately that's what provides them with that sense of belonging and support.
I love that. It's so simple and actionable and, like you said, so powerful. And speaking of powerful, this whole deep dive has been incredibly insightful. And before we wrap up, I always like to, give our listeners something to kind of ponder, a final thought to spark some more exploration on their own. Right?
Yeah, I love it.
So what if, and this is just a thought experiment here,
Okay.
what if we actually involved our kids in this whole process of understanding how their brains work?
Oh, that's interesting. What do you have in mind?
So instead of just setting those limits, those rules, right? What if we actually talk to them about how their choices, whether it's the food that they eat or how much sleep they get or how they're managing their stress,
Right.
how all of that directly impacts their brain function, right? Their mood, their ability to learn and just thrive in the world.
I see what you're saying.
What if we empowered them with that knowledge from a really young age?
I love that. So it's you're giving them that agency.
Yes.
You're helping them understand the why behind the what.
Exactly.
And they become active participants in their own well-being rather
Yeah.
than just, passive recipients of our rules.
Yes. Imagine the possibilities if our kids really develop that sense of ownership over their mental and emotional health, from a young age. That's incredible.
It is.
It's we're setting them up for this lifelong journey of self-discovery and growth. And on that note, my friend, that is a wrap on our deep dive into raising mentally strong kids. We explored the connection between the brain and behavior. We uncovered some really practical strategies for navigating those everyday parenting challenges. And hopefully you're walking away feeling, a little bit more confident, maybe even a little bit excited about this whole journey of raising these incredible humans.
I am.
Right. So until next time, happy parenting, everyone.